In 2003, Steve Jobs found out he had cancer. His doctors told him the tumor was small, caught early, operable. All he had to do was say yes to surgery. He said no. For 9 months, he sat with a growing tumor inside him and chose fruit juice instead, acupuncture, herbal remedies from the internet, a psychic. His wife begged him. His doctors warned him the window was closing. His closest friends pleaded with him. He refused. He told his biographer later, "I didn't want my body to be opened. I didn't want to be violated in that way." By the time he agreed to surgery, 9 months later, the cancer had spread. He died at 56. Now, here is the question. This is the same man who spent his entire career pushing people past what they thought was possible, who rejected limits, who treated fear as something other people had, who built a company worth hundreds of billions on the idea that the rules don't apply if you refuse to accept them. That man was undone by a surgical incision he refused to make. Why? Open the file. Before we answer that question, we need to establish something first. Because the cancer is not where this story starts, it's where it ends. The story starts much earlier, and it starts with behavior that most people either excuse or explain away. Steve Jobs had a daughter named Lisa. He found out she was his in 1978. A DNA test confirmed it. His response? He denied it publicly anyway, told a magazine he was not the father, refused to pay child support until a court ordered him to. For years, he claimed the Apple Lisa computer, named, as he would later admit, after his daughter, had nothing to do with her. When Lisa was 9 years old, she came to visit him. She brought a friend, a 9-year-old girl named Sarah. At dinner, Jobs looked at Sarah and asked why she talked like that, then told her, "You can't even speak properly. You're eating garbage." Sarah was 9 years old. She was trying not to cry. "I wish I wasn't here." At Apple, engineers who had spent weeks on a project would show it to Jobs. He would look at it for 5 seconds and say, "Start over." Not, "It needs work." Start over. Walter Isaacson, who spent years with Jobs writing his biography, described what employees called the pattern. Jobs divided everyone around him into 2 categories, geniuses or idiots. And the category could change without warning. The person who was a genius on Monday could be publicly humiliated on Friday for work that hadn't changed at all. So here's what the evidence actually shows. A man who denied his own daughter existed, humiliated a child at his dinner table, treated world-class engineers like failures, and refused cancer surgery for 9 months while consulting a psychic. We know what he did. What we don't yet know is why. And the obvious answers don't hold up. Hypothesis 1. The most common explanation. Steve Jobs was a genius, and geniuses are difficult. High standards, low tolerance for mediocrity, brilliant but impossible to work with. This contains some truth. He did have extraordinary standards. He cared about things other people didn't notice. The weight of a device in your hand, the sound a box made when you opened it. In 1982, he insisted that the circuit board inside the Macintosh, hidden inside a sealed case, something no customer would ever open or see, had to be aesthetically beautiful. Engineers told him no one would ever see it. He said a great carpenter doesn't use cheap wood for the back of a cabinet, even if no one sees it. They gave in. They redesigned the board. But here is where "he was just difficult" breaks down. Difficult people, people with genuinely high standards, become calmer after they've proven themselves. Once you've built the Mac and the iPod and the iPhone, the world has given you its verdict. You don't need to keep proving it. Jobs became more intense after each success, not less. And then there's Steve Wozniak. Wozniak co-founded Apple. He built the machines that started everything: the Apple I, the Apple II, hardware that engineers still study today. He left Apple in 1985, quietly, without drama. He went on to teach elementary school children. He gave away his own Apple shares to employees who had been left out of the original deal. He remained, by every account, satisfied. Wozniak once said, "My goal was never to beat anyone. I just wanted to make something good." Something good. Two words Jobs could never have said without flinching. Same era, same company, same starting point. One built something extraordinary and felt it was enough. The other built 10 times more and couldn't stop. That difference is not about talent. It's not about ambition. "He was just difficult" doesn't explain it. Hypothesis 1 doesn't fit. Hypothesis 2. Maybe the answer is simpler. He needed to be the best. The competition never turned off. And when you frame it that way, a lot of the behavior makes sense. The impossible deadlines, the refusal to accept that something couldn't be done, the intensity that never let up, no matter how much he'd already achieved. But then you look at his relationship with money, and something doesn't fit. Jobs was worth billions. He took a $1 salary from Apple, wore essentially the same outfit every day, showed almost no interest in the status symbols that usually come with that kind of wealth. No yacht, no private island, no art collection. That matters, because if winning were the goal, if competition and status drove everything, the money would have been enough. It never was. What he seemed obsessed with was not owning extraordinary things. It was creating them. Each product, each launch, each version, as if he was trying to answer something, and whatever that something was, winning didn't answer it. Hypothesis 2 doesn't fit either. At this point, we have a problem. Neither explanation accounts for the full pattern. Difficult genius explains the standards, not the cruelty. Needed to win explains the drive, not the inability to enjoy the victories. And neither comes close to explaining the cancer. A man who needs to win doesn't choose a psychic over a surgeon. A man with high standards doesn't apply magical thinking to his own body. When the simple explanations fail, the real answer is usually earlier, not in the behavior, in what created the behavior. So we go back, further than Apple, further than Silicon Valley, all the way to the beginning. Steve Jobs was born in 1955 to a woman named Joanne Schiebel. Her parents didn't approve of the man she was with, so when she became pregnant, she gave the baby up for adoption. Paul and Clara Jobs took him in, a working-class couple in Palo Alto. They loved him, and they told him what most adoptive parents in that era were advised to say. You weren't abandoned. You were chosen. We picked you specially. Jobs carried that his entire life. But here is the sentence hidden inside that one. His parents told him, "We chose you." A child hears something else underneath. Someone else didn't. Both things were true at the same time. Someone chose you, and someone else decided you were not worth staying for. A child is unlikely to process that contradiction logically. What often remains is not a conclusion, but a question. Quiet, persistent. Am I actually enough? Now, look at what Jobs did with that question. He couldn't answer it by thinking about it, so he tried to answer it by doing, by building things so extraordinary that the answer would become undeniable. The Mac, the iPod, the iPhone, each one a kind of verdict. But here is the thing about verdicts on questions like that. They don't hold. The world says yes. The feeling lasts for a moment, and then it fades, and the question comes back, quietly, the same as before. Now, look at the cruelty differently. When Jobs told a 9-year-old girl she couldn't speak properly, when he humiliated engineers whose work was genuinely exceptional, when he denied his own daughter for years, this behavior appears less consistent with a man who needs to control others, and more consistent with someone who struggles to tolerate any reminder that imperfection exists, including in himself, including in the people closest to him. Because if the people around you are imperfect, maybe you are too. And if you are, the question has its answer, and it's no. In 1985, Apple's board voted to remove Jobs from the company. He was 30 years old. He had co-founded Apple. He had driven the Mac. He was Apple in every way that mattered, and they voted him out. Think about what that moment meant for someone carrying that childhood question. This was not just losing a job. This was the nightmare. You can be chosen, and then you can be given away again. So what did he do? He didn't disappear. He didn't take time off. Within weeks, he founded Next, built from nothing, because the only way to answer the question was to prove it wrong again. The Next computer was over-engineered and too expensive and commercially unsuccessful. But the software it ran was used by Tim Berners-Lee to invent the World Wide Web. Then Jobs bought a small animation studio from George Lucas for $5 million, renamed it Pixar, Toy Story, Finding Nemo, The Incredibles. He sold Pixar to Disney in 2006 for $7.4 billion. And then Apple came back to him. In 1997, they asked him to return. And here is the detail that matters most. By then, he had built 2 world-changing things without Apple. He had survived being given away. He had answered the question twice. And yet, when he came back, the intensity didn't decrease. It increased. The standards got higher. The need to make something perfect, even the parts nobody could see, became more urgent, not less. Because each answer only held for a while. And then the question came back, the same as always. Now go back to 2003. The tumor. The 9 months, the psychic. Jobs told Isaacson, I felt that if you don't want something to exist, you can make it not exist. He had done that his whole career, told engineers that physically impossible deadlines were still going to happen. And they happened. Told himself at 30 that being expelled from the company he built was not the end. And it wasn't. He had applied the same logic. If I refuse to accept this reality, I can create a different one. To everything. The reality distortion field. The mechanism that made him Steve Jobs. And now he applied it to cancer. The same pattern. The same tendency to resist realities that threatened the identity he had spent a lifetime building. A pattern that appears to have emerged long before Apple existed. He lost that one. He died at 56. And on his deathbed, he wept and told Lisa, the daughter he had denied, the daughter whose friend he had humiliated at his dinner table, the daughter whose calls he had ignored for a decade. I owe you one. Over and over. I owe you one. History remembers Steve Jobs as a visionary. That is probably true. What this case suggests is not that he lacked greatness. It suggests that greatness may never have resolved the question he was trying to answer. The world kept giving him evidence that he was extraordinary. He kept building as if the verdict were still pending. Perfectionism explains part of that. The need to win explains part of that. But neither explains the moving finish line. The model that best fits the known evidence is not a diagnosis. It is a possibility. That achievement may have functioned for Steve Jobs as a repeated attempt to answer a question of worth that began long before Apple existed. We cannot know with certainty whether he experienced his life that way. What we can say is this: a man who changed the world and still could not experience the feeling of enough. In the end, the force that helped him bend reality around products could not bend reality around a tumor. And that may be the most revealing contradiction in the entire file. Case closed.